have the good fortune of having a lot of synchronistic things happen in my life. And so last week, Barbara Oliver's friend Jennifer was here, and we were talking about books in Peabody Hall because Jennifer used to be a salesperson for a scholarly book company in London for a large portion of her adult life. And so she said, "Oh, have you read Down from the Holy Mountain by William Dalrymple," which is a book that did they read it just recently, or I'm not sure, but anyhow, she was very fascinated with this book. And so I looked it up online later, and it compared the book to another travel book that happens to be one of my favorite books, which is by Bruce Chatwin, called In Patagonia. And so the reviewer said, this is the best travel book since that book. So anyhow, I got the book. But as often happens when I'm browsing around looking for books, there's another book that shows up that looks interesting. And there was a book about lost Christianity. And the lost Christianity that it was referring to was the Eastern Church. And I started this book by this scholar. I was also drawn to it because Stelly and I used to live in State College, and the guy that wrote this book works at Penn State. And in it, he describes the Eastern Church. And when he says Eastern Church, he doesn't mean when there was the split between Rome and Constantinople that occurs like 1,000 years later. He was talking about the Eastern Church that came out of the apostles that went eastward from Jerusalem, not Paul that went westward from Jerusalem after the death and resurrection of Jesus. And that Eastern Church is not part of what this author calls our Eurocentric view of Christianity, meaning that most of what we think about Christianity sort of comes out of a very maybe Mediterranean, European perspective. But the truth is that up until 1400, the Eastern Church far outnumbered in population, churches, bishops, and whatever, the Western Church. It had its own leaders that were like popes. They didn't call them popes, but this church, this Eastern Church, and there were several varieties of it. Some were called Nestorian, some were called Jacobite, some were called Assyrian, but it stretched all the way to India. The central seat of power, if you want to call it that, was actually near Baghdad in Iraq. It was in a place called Seleucia or Ctesiphon, which is right next to the Tigris rivers in Mesopotamia. And as I was reading that book, I read about I'll call him a patriarch of that church. He was sort of the spiritual and political leader of the Eastern Church. All of the different varieties of churches looked up to him, and his name was Timothy. And he told a story that was well known at the time, and the reason that he told this story is because Christianity was not the dominant political church of the empire. Almost all of that Eastern Church during his time was under the political rule of Islam. And they enjoyed quite peaceful coexistence during that time. And whenever there was a new Muslim ruler, a political figure, he would meet with them. Timothy would meet with them, and he would tell this story. He would start out by saying, we're all a little bit ignorant. We're all like living in a dark room in this world. And God has dropped this pearl into the room. And amongst all the other things that are in this room, all of us pick up objects. And all of us believe that we hold that pearl. Yet we know that some of us don't, because there's only one pearl. That's the story. I thought a lot about this story this past week, and I can tell you that my understanding of this story has evolved to something different every single day. The most fascinating thing to me about this story is that it works. Even though I don't think it accurately represents our relationship or human beings' relationship to God, the story seems to work with all of the political leaders that Timothy tells the story to, because they seem to kind of nod their acceptance of this idea that there is this pearl that's been dropped into this darkness of this world, and that somebody possesses it. The closest I could come to thinking about why it worked, and I'd be curious if any of you ever have any ideas about why the story works, is that because Timothy and the person he is talking to both accept that they are in darkness, neither one knows whether they have the pearl or not. So even though you might believe that you hold this precious pearl of whatever it is that God gives as a gift, you have to be pretty humble, because what if the light comes and you're not holding the pearl? So you have this both anticipation that there's this gift, but then there's also this kind of humility that, like, what if you're not holding it? What if you don't have the pearl? So I think that uncertainty was just the kind of thing that gave pause to any kind of conflict in the relationship. It's sort of like saying, oh, wait a minute, what if I'm not right? Maybe I better listen a little better to what someone else has to say. Or maybe if I feel strong enough, I can find a way to express what I have in such a way that I can bond with the person that I'm speaking to. That's the best I can come up with why it works. Now, the curious thing about it is, as the week went on, I realized that no, this story does not represent what I think our human condition is in relation to the divine. It's a story that's like some other stories that have been told, like the stories of alchemy or the Philosopher's Stone. All of those stories, in the case of alchemists and the Philosopher's Stone, were all about turning base metals into gold, or having a Philosopher's Stone that had some type of healing power. And the problem with all of those stories is that they're externally focused. At one point, when I was talking to the spiritual growth group on Tuesday, I thought it would have been a little better to have a story where this object that God drops into the room sort of breaks into different parts and everybody gets a piece of the real story, and so you kind of need everybody else to sort of put it together, and we all make some kind of contribution to what the real picture looks like. Maybe part of that story would be that if you got all of the pieces and everybody got together and cooperate, that would be what turned on the light. You never know. However, even that one doesn't hit the mark. It doesn't hit the mark because I've heard a different story at one time. And that different story goes a little bit like this. If God decided to hide the most precious thing in the world somewhere in this world, where would God put it? For those of you that grew up in the Jewish tradition, you may have heard this story. And the story goes that, well, to make human beings really work for it, God put it in their heart. Because after spending all their time exploring the whole world out there and not finding it, where would they have to look? They'd have to look within. And I think that's why, for me, this idea that something was put by God from the outside into a place where the people would go outward to get it misses the point. It's very effective for keeping peace between the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews and everybody else that lived in all those holy lands. But the real truth is, we're the gift. The real truth is that it's been placed in our hearts. And that the reason it works with everybody in the room is because everybody has the same gift. They may have received it in a different way. They may recognize it in a different way. They may hear it in a different language. They may give it a different name, but it's the same gift. Now, what's important about this story to me, in a way, is how it relates to Palm Sunday. Because to me, there is a connection between these two stories, or these multiple stories, and this event of Palm Sunday. One of the things that I noticed about people that study the Bible, which in my Bible study and other places, is that people tend to always see themselves as the subject of the story, not the object of the story. Meaning that they see themselves as the observer of the story or of the thing that's happening out there. When we talk about the lost sheep, it's always somebody else that's a lost sheep. We don't consider that, well, we're the lost sheep. Or when somebody needs to be healed, we think, well, that's the other person that needs to be healed, not me. But I think that we're actually every actor and every role in the story. We're not just the lost sheep. We're the shepherd that goes and finds the lost sheep. We're not just the person that needs to be healed. We're also the healer. We're not the person that has the authority that Jesus has when he stands up in the synagogue the first time and says that this is the day of the Lord. And then later he goes out and the legion of swine go over the hill. We are actually that same authority in the synagogue ourselves. And we are those swine that run over the hill to self-destruction. We are every single part of the story because we need every part of the story to be whole. We need every part of the story to be whole because no matter how elevated we think we are, we have flaws. No matter how important we think we are, we know that every single human being is important. So why is the idea of the gift so important? Well, that's one reason it's important. But this story about arrival in Jerusalem is important because at some point in our life, we arrive. And I want to tell you when that moment is, at least from my perspective. We arrive as human beings when two things happen. Just two. And they can happen anytime and anywhere. And they can happen multiple times. Okay? We arrive, number one, when we realize that we are that gift. When Jesus sits outside the gates of Jerusalem and he's ready to enter, I believe that he knows he is the gift for that moment. He realizes that he has something to give that'll make a difference on his entry into Jerusalem. The second thing, after we've recognized that we are that gift, is that we come face to face with our purpose or our destiny, where everything is on the line about who we are and who we serve and what we have to give. When those two things come together, you've arrived. And that's exactly what comes together for him in Jerusalem. His purpose is never more clearly stated than when he is in Jerusalem in front of Pilate and says, I came to bear witness to the truth. To me, that was a human being that understood the gift that he was, and no matter the circumstances staring him in the face, he could articulate that he was a witness to the fullness of everything that was happening in front of him. That he could lay down his life for what he believed his purpose was as a human being. How many times in our lives are we going to come to that kind of moment? How many times can we stand across from another human being, whether it's at coffee hour or in a casual conversation or someone that you meet on the street, and have the awareness that we individually are a gift in that moment? Sometimes our purpose might be rather small. It might just be a kind word. Sometimes it might be larger, where we see someone in need or in distress and we step in to help. But when we realize that we are that gift and we can act with that awareness in that moment to give of ourselves, we've arrived as human beings.